The government decided to drain the old city canal for the first time in 70 years, not realizing what was hidden beneath the thick layer of silt. When the water receded, one of the workers noticed a strange orange glow at the bottom. He had no idea that this discovery would change his life forever and shock the entire world. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to comment where you're watching this video from. The smell of salt and rust drifted through the coastal air of Richmond as the city council gathered inside the aging municipal building. The walls of the old town hall bore water stains from decades of humidity, and the marble floor, once polished to a sheen, had long since dulled under the tread of civil servants and residents demanding repairs that never came. The canal that ran through the heart of the city had once been its pride, a gleaming artery built 70 years ago to bring seawater inland, powering mills and cooling factories. But now it was a dark ribbon of decay, a stagnant trench lined with algae and the ghosts of industrial glory. For decades, it had been left to rot, a forgotten relic that smelled of rot and history. On that autumn morning, the city's leaders sat around a long table, their papers stacked like fragile walls against accountability. Engineers, environmental specialists, and sanitation officials filled the room with graphs, water samples, and bureaucratic language that softened the magnitude of the problem. The canal had become dangerous. Walls were collapsing in several sectors, the base had eroded, and the water flow was obstructed by tons of sludge. Entire sections were now breeding grounds for mosquitoes, while in other parts, the smell of decay could be sensed even from the upper streets. The last maintenance had been done 50 years earlier, a forgotten line in the archives of the Department of Public Works. Now, after years of neglect, the canal had reached the point of no return. Outside, onlookers gathered behind the barricades, watching through the cracked windows as officials debated budgets and timelines. The rumor spread fast across the city that something big was finally happening. For months, local newspapers had been publishing photos of the collapsing canal walls, calling it the silent disaster of Richmond. When the mayor entered the room, everyone rose automatically, though the gesture carried more fatigue than respect. She adjusted her glasses, looked down at the reports, and declared in her calm, deliberate voice that the time for delay was over. For the first time in 70 years, the old canal would be completely emptied, cleaned, and inspected from end to end. The decision was met with cautious applause, though most of the people in the room were already calculating what it would cost. The mayor emphasized transparency and environmental restoration, promising that the city would bring the river back to life. Yet, among the older citizens who remembered the years when the canal had been open and vibrant, there was an unspoken worry. They said that some things were better left buried under the mud. They whispered about old rumors, of barrels dumped during the industrial boom, of missing workers from the 1960s construction phase, of a strange reddish glow once seen near the lower locks. But no one took the stories seriously anymore. Time had washed away both fear and curiosity. Across town, a man named Michael Harris heard the announcement on a small radio while sitting at the kitchen table of his rented apartment. He was in his early 50s, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose face had the quiet expression of someone who had worked with his hands all his life. For more than 20 years, Michael had worked as a dock laborer and later as a canal maintenance worker, cleaning storm drains and removing debris from minor waterways. He lived alone now, in a modest building near the harbor, surrounded by boxes of old notebooks and tools. His routine was simple: work, eat, rest, and write small notes in the evening about what he had seen that day. He wasn't a man of ambition, but he valued precision. Every task, no matter how dirty or small, had to be done properly. When the job postings for the canal restoration appeared, Michael signed up immediately. The city's subcontractor, a large construction company, was hiring dozens of temporary workers for what was expected to be a 6-month operation. They needed people who could handle the heavy manual work, digging, clearing debris, maintaining pumps, and assisting engineers. During the orientation meeting, the supervisors spoke in loud, efficient tones about safety rules and shift schedules. Most of the younger workers paid little attention, joking and checking their phones. Michael, however, listened closely, taking mental notes. The engineers distributed old blueprints of the canal system. The main flow stretched for several kilometers, cutting through the city's industrial district before dividing into smaller channels near the docks. Michael was assigned to one of those smaller branches, a narrow side channel that had been sealed off decades ago. It wasn't important to the overall water flow anymore, but the company wanted it inspected and cleared as a precaution. "It's a dead end," one of the supervisors told him. "Just mud and trash. You'll probably find nothing but rats and tires down there." Michael nodded. He didn't mind the isolation. In fact, he preferred it. When he first saw the canal from above, he felt something almost solemn. The water was thick and brown, covered with floating film, and the concrete walls leaned at odd angles. Old railings had rusted through, and weeds grew in the cracks. He imagined the men who had built this place in the 1950s, engineers with clipboards, workers with shovels, cranes swinging heavy slabs into place. They had believed it would last forever. Now, their creation looked like an open wound cutting through the heart of the city. Over the following days, teams began installing pumps and barriers. Water levels slowly dropped, revealing more and more of the forgotten bottom. The stench grew unbearable at times, forcing workers to wear masks. Dead fish, bottles, plastic, and even the remains of old furniture emerged from the muck. Children and curious residents gathered along the banks to watch as if it were a public performance. News crews filmed the progress, showing images of excavators pulling centuries of sediment from the canal bed. For Michael, the work had a strange rhythm. He spent hours scraping, shoveling, and pushing layers of mud aside, marking every piece of metal or stone that seemed out of place. The other workers mocked his thoroughness, calling him the archaeologist. But he didn't care. He felt that this place had stories hidden beneath its surface, waiting for someone to uncover them properly. The side channel where he was stationed was quieter than the main one, removed from the noise of machines. It was shaded by old poplars and cut off from traffic. At dusk, when the others left, Michael often lingered, standing on the exposed ground, staring at the uneven texture of the canal bed. There was something about the silence that compelled him to look closer. The air was heavy with moisture and the distant hum of pumps. Every now and then, he'd spot fragments of pottery, twisted metal, or bits of old pipes. He recorded their positions in a small notebook. To anyone else, it would have seemed meaningless, but to him, these fragments formed a kind of language, a way to understand how time and neglect had layered themselves here. Meanwhile, across the city, the project became the talk of every household. Some residents complained that the cleanup was taking too long or that it was a waste of taxpayer money. Others celebrated the idea that Richmond was finally addressing its decay. The mayor gave interviews about sustainability, promising that once the canal was restored, new parks and walkways would follow. Yet, behind the optimism, there was pressure. Delays could mean political embarrassment. Contractors were ordered to accelerate the pace. On the 5th week of draining, the main canal had been reduced to narrow, shallow pools of murky water. Bulldozers were scraping the exposed earth, and trucks hauled away mountains of sludge. Michael's side channel, however, remained largely untouched. The machinery couldn't easily reach it due to its narrow width and old retaining walls. He and the 2 other workers were assigned to proceed manually. They worked in silence, using shovels and buckets, occasionally uncovering small relics, rusted chains, fragments of ceramic tiles, even a bent brass nameplate from a long-defunct factory. Michael cleaned each object with care and set it aside for documentation. As the sun began to set one evening, the reflection of light along the moist channel walls created a surreal orange glow. The shadows stretched long, and the air smelled of wet stone. Michael paused, wiping sweat from his forehead, and gazed at the murky surface near the far bend of the channel. There was something about the light there. It shimmered differently, faintly, like a distant lantern behind fog. He squinted, but the glow vanished. He thought it must have been a trick of the sun, filtered through the oily film on the water. Still, the image lingered in his mind. That night, as he sat in his small apartment with the radio playing low jazz from an old station, he opened his notebook and drew a rough sketch of the canal section where he'd seen the strange reflection. He marked the approximate coordinates, noting the soil texture and water depth. To anyone else, it would have seemed obsessive, but to him, the record mattered. The next morning, he decided he would check the spot again, this time carefully before the crews arrived. Outside, the city slept under a thin fog, the air heavy with the scent of the sea. In the stillness, the pumps continued their low, mechanical breathing, slowly draining what remained of the canal. The work lights along the embankment cast long, trembling beams across the waterlogged ground, and the reflection of those beams danced against the peeling walls of old warehouses nearby. Richmond was finally confronting the dark underbelly of its forgotten waterway, and somewhere in that mud, waiting for dawn, something was beginning to reveal itself. The decision that had begun as a bureaucratic necessity had awakened something larger, an intersection of time, memory, and hidden consequence. Michael didn't know it yet, but the careful precision that guided his every movement was about to lead him toward a discovery that would alter not only his own life, but the history of the entire city. The canal, emptied after 70 long years, was beginning to breathe again, and with each breath it stirred the past from its muddy sleep. When dawn came, the fog still hung over the city like a heavy veil. The hum of pumps filled the air, steady and low, as if the old canal itself was sighing after decades of silence. The once flowing artery that had cut through Richmond now lay exposed and motionless, its muddy bed glistening in the pale morning light. Michael Harris stood at the edge of the side channel, staring down into what yesterday had been only murky water. Now, drained almost completely, the channel looked like a scar, a long, dark trench stretching into the distance, bordered by cracked concrete walls covered with moss and streaks of rust. The air smelled thickly of decay, of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Michael descended slowly, his boots sinking into the damp ground with each step. Around him, the city had barely awakened. A few voices echoed distantly from the main section of the canal where machinery had already started rumbling. But here, in this forgotten branch, everything was still. He preferred it that way. The isolation allowed him to focus on the details, the texture of the silt, the way light reflected off the uneven walls, the hidden history embedded in every layer of mud. He began his work methodically. First, he marked the section he would clear, driving 2 short stakes into the ground and running a thin cord between them. Then, with his shovel, he began scraping away the upper layer of sediment. The sound of metal against wet earth was rhythmic, almost meditative. Every few minutes, he stopped to examine what he uncovered: bits of wood, rusted bolts, fragments of glass bottles so corroded they crumbled at his touch. Each discovery seemed insignificant, yet to him they formed a mosaic of forgotten life. He placed the small finds on a tarp beside him, wiping them clean with a rag. As the morning light brightened, the walls of the canal revealed more of their story. The concrete was discolored with veins of iron and streaks of black algae that had fossilized into the surface. In some places, the original brick lining from the 1950s showed through, crumbling and uneven. Michael could almost see the ghosts of the workers who had laid those bricks, their sweat and effort buried under 70 years of neglect. One of the engineers had mentioned that this channel had been sealed off during a reconstruction in the late 1960s. There were no detailed records explaining why. Perhaps it had simply become unnecessary after new drainage systems were built. But as Michael moved along the bed, he noticed that the structure of the walls didn't match the main canal's layout. The curvature was slightly different, and there were traces of older masonry beneath the modern repairs. It was as if this channel had been built over something else, something even older. By mid-morning, the sun burned through the fog, turning the air heavy and bright. The surface of the mud shimmered in golden tones, and the stench of decay intensified. Michael paused to drink water from a bottle, his gloved hands streaked with brown and black stains. Across the canal, a heron stood motionless on a pile of debris, watching him with yellow eyes. Everything about this place felt ancient and patient, as though time itself had slowed here, unwilling to move forward. In one corner of the channel, near the curve that bent toward the docks, he found something unusual: a cluster of rusted iron rods protruding from the wall, arranged in a circular pattern. He knelt and brushed away the mud. The rods were thick, their ends fused together with corrosion, but their arrangement looked deliberate. He guessed it might have been part of an old drainage gate, though he couldn't recall seeing anything like it on the maps. He noted the position carefully in his notebook, marking it with a sketch and a description. By noon, the heat made the mud glisten like oil. The other workers passed by occasionally, shouting greetings or jokes as they hauled debris from the main canal. "How's the museum, Mike?" one of them called out. "Find any gold yet?" Michael smiled faintly but didn't answer. The others thought he took the job too seriously. To them, this was just another cleanup contract. To him, it was more, a chance to see how the city's veins had aged, to understand the layers beneath its skin. When lunch came, he stayed behind instead of joining the others at the food truck by the bridge. He sat on a broken concrete ledge and opened a sandwich he had brought from home. The air shimmered with heat, and the sound of distant machinery blended with the cries of gulls. From where he sat, he could see the stretch of the channel that curved into shadow beneath a low overhang. That was the area he had marked in his notebook the night before, the place where he thought he had seen something glow. After eating, he stood up and walked toward it. The ground became softer there, the mud thicker and darker. The water that remained formed shallow pools reflecting the gray sky. He crouched and poked the surface with the tip of his shovel. Nothing unusual, just silt and decayed leaves. But as he shifted slightly, the angle of light changed, and for a split second he saw it again, a faint orange glimmer beneath the water. It wasn't bright, not enough to be light in itself, but it stood out against the dull gray around it. He froze. The reflection didn't move with the ripples. It was coming from beneath. He knelt and leaned closer, brushing aside the muddy film with his gloved hand. There, under a thin layer of sediment, something smooth caught the light. The shape was indistinct, but it was rounded, like a buried stone or perhaps a large piece of polished metal. He stared at it for a long moment, then marked the spot with a small flag. He wanted to dig, but instinct told him to wait until the next morning when the light would be clearer and he could document everything properly. When the whistle signaled the end of the shift, Michael was still down in the channel, staring at that patch of mud as the shadows stretched across it. He finally climbed out, packed his tools, and made his way home through the streets lined with low, sun-bleached houses. The day's fatigue pressed on his shoulders, but his mind stayed alert, turning over possibilities. It might be nothing. A rusted barrel, a chunk of old clay, some discarded machine part, but something about the glow felt wrong. It hadn't looked metallic. It had looked alive, as if it were reflecting not just light, but warmth. That night, he barely slept. He kept imagining the color. Deep, dark orange, richer than rust but softer than fire. It reminded him of amber. He had seen pieces of amber once when he was young, displayed in a seaside museum, small fragments holding ancient insects. But this had been different. The light hadn't been from within, but through, as if the thing beneath the mud was breathing faintly. He told himself it was probably a trick of the light. Yet, by dawn, his decision was made. He would return to that spot first thing and dig carefully before the others began their work. Outside, the city stirred again to life, the fog returning briefly before dissolving under the first rays of sun. On the streets near the canal, trucks rumbled by, and the faint smell of fuel mixed with the ever-present scent of brine. At the work site, men shouted instructions and machines clanked into motion. But in the quiet end of the side channel, where no one paid attention, Michael descended once more into the shadowed trench, his boots splashing softly in the shallow pools. He moved with purpose, each step sinking deeper into the cool mud, every sound around him dampened by the heavy air. He reached the flagged spot and knelt, his breath steady. The mud was thick, almost clay-like, sticking to his gloves. He began to clear it slowly, centimeter by centimeter, exposing the smooth surface beneath. It wasn't rock, that much he could tell immediately. The texture was too soft, too polished, with a faintly oily sheen. As he scraped, the faint orange hue returned, deepening where the morning light struck it directly. He realized then that whatever it wasn't reflecting the light, it was refracting it. The glow seemed to come from within. He stopped, wiping sweat from his forehead, his heart pounding harder now. He didn't know what he had found, only that it didn't belong here. He covered it gently with a thin layer of wet cloth to prevent drying, then stood up and called his supervisor over the radio. The man's voice crackled with annoyance until Michael mentioned the words smooth surface and light reflection. That caught his attention. Within the hour, an engineer arrived, followed by a small team from the environmental office. They photographed the site, measured coordinates, and decided to extract the object the next day using special tools. As the crew packed up, Michael remained by the edge of the pit, watching the muddy water slide back over the exposed surface. The orange glow disappeared once more beneath the thin layer of silt. The sun was high now, casting harsh white light over everything, and the air smelled of oil and metal. But beneath that glare, the faint memory of the glow lingered in his vision. He didn't know it yet, but this was a moment when his careful, solitary work stopped being routine. The canal, silent and forgotten for 70 years, had whispered its first secret through the mud. Somewhere, deep in the sediment, a piece of the city's buried past had stirred, and Michael, the quiet worker everyone ignored, had been the one to notice. That evening, as he walked home, he glanced once more at the canal behind him. The machinery had gone still for the night, leaving the long trench in shadow. The smell of damp concrete filled the air. For a moment, he imagined the past, the workers of the 1950s, the builders of the canal, the generations who had relied on it. All of them gone, their efforts buried beneath the layers of time. And now, under his hands, something from that same forgotten past was about to return to the surface. He reached his apartment, washed the grime from his skin, and opened his notebook. His handwriting was slow and deliberate as he recorded every detail: the time, the coordinates, the soil condition, the color of the glow. He paused over the last line before closing the book. Unidentified object, possible composite material, color, dark amber, orange, source of light unclear. He underlined the last sentence twice. Then, sitting in the dim light of his kitchen, he stared out the window at the distant cranes along the harbor. He felt both excitement and unease. Whatever lay buried in that channel had waited for decades, and now, through the steady persistence of a single worker, it had been found. In the morning, he would return, and the real work would begin. The morning broke sharp and clear, the kind of morning that made the city seem new even when every surface told a story of age. A cool wind swept over Richmond, drying the puddles left by the night's faint drizzle, and for a brief moment the air carried a scent of salt that reminded Michael of his years working along the docks. It was early, earlier than any shift required him to be there, but he had barely slept. He had dreamed of the faint orange light beneath the mud, how it had glimmered like a living thing, and every time he closed his eyes it returned, shining faintly from the darkness of his memory. By the time dawn paled the horizon, he had already gathered his tools and made his way toward the canal. The city was still half asleep as he walked. The street lights flickered in the mist, and a few delivery trucks rolled past, their engines echoing softly between the narrow brick buildings. When he reached the work site, the machines stood silent, their metal frames wet with dew. The pumps hummed quietly, keeping the remaining water from creeping back into the drained channel. Michael descended carefully down the ladder that led to the muddy floor of the side canal, his boots squelching as they met the damp ground. The silence was complete here, broken only by the soft dripping of condensation from the walls. He took out his small notebook and glanced at the sketch he had made the night before. The flag he had planted was still there, half buried in the mud where he had left it. He approached it slowly, feeling the weight of expectation building in his chest. Kneeling beside the marked spot, he began clearing the top layer of mud again, this time with smaller tools, a trowel and a soft brush he had brought from home. The air was thick and heavy, and even the faint breeze from above didn't reach this far down. Within minutes, his gloves were slick with black silt, his movements careful and deliberate. The first glimpse of the surface came sooner than he expected. Beneath a thin sheet of mud, the smooth curve of the object revealed itself, glistening faintly in the dim light. It looked almost like polished stone, but it wasn't stone. Its texture was too soft, too smooth, and as he brushed it clean, the strange color deepened. It was unlike anything he had seen before. Dark amber in the shadows, orange where the light caught it, almost translucent along the edges. The surface seemed to capture and bend the light rather than reflect it, as though something within it drank the brightness and gave it back altered. Michael felt his pulse quicken. He leaned closer, studying the object from every angle, his breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. The more he cleaned, the larger it appeared. It wasn't a small stone or a chunk of metal as he had first imagined. It was nearly the size of a human head, egg-shaped and heavy-looking even while buried. He realized he couldn't remove it alone without damaging it. He would need to document its position first, mark its exact dimensions, and call for assistance. He stood and looked around. The early sunlight was filtering through the gaps above, casting a pale golden stripe along the wall of the canal. In that light, the orange of the object seemed to glow softly, almost pulsing with color. He took out his phone and snapped several photographs, adjusting the angle to capture its sheen. Then he set up small measuring markers, taking notes of the distances and depth. Everything about this felt wrong and right at the same time. Wrong because it didn't belong, and right because it felt as if it had waited for someone precisely like him to find it. When the others arrived an hour later, they found Michael already waist-deep in the trench, methodically clearing the perimeter around the buried shape. The younger workers leaned over the railing, laughing and calling out guesses as to what it might be. Some thought it was an old chemical drum. Others said maybe it was petrified wood or some industrial waste hardened over the years. Michael ignored them. He simply kept working, careful not to scratch the surface, his eyes tracing the delicate curve that disappeared deeper into the ground. Soon the foreman arrived. A thick-set man named Briggs. He had the tired authority of someone who'd seen more messes than miracles. He frowned when he saw Michael's flag and the exposed object beneath it. "You're sure this isn't metal?" he asked, squatting down. Michael handed him one of the photographs. "Look at the color," he said quietly. Briggs bent closer, tapping the surface lightly with a gloved finger. "Not metal," he murmured. "Feels like resin. But what kind of resin lasts 70 years underground?" He straightened and rubbed his chin. "All right. We'll get the city's lab team here. Don't touch it until they've seen it." The rest of the day passed in slow motion. Workers continued cleaning the main canal. Trucks rolled back and forth, but Michael stayed by the find, watching as the lab technicians arrived with their equipment. They spoke in clipped tones, their movements efficient and precise. They photographed, measured, and then gently began the process of loosening the surrounding soil. When the object finally came free, the sunlight struck it directly for the first time. The color deepened, rich and warm, like a captured sunset. Even the technicians paused for a moment, murmuring among themselves. Michael watched in silence as they lifted it carefully into a padded container. He noted how heavy it seemed, how one of the technicians grunted under its weight despite its moderate size. The object was smooth all around. No markings, no signs of corrosion or damage. When they tilted it slightly, it caught the light and seemed to shimmer with an inner depth, as though tiny flecks of gold were suspended beneath the surface. It was beautiful, in a strange, unsettling way, too perfect to be industrial waste, too organic to be stone. Before sealing the container, one of the scientists knelt and took a small scraping from the underside. The tool made almost no sound against it, and the shavings that came off were fine, waxy, and faintly aromatic. Michael caught the scent for a second, a mix of salt, musk, and something indescribably sweet. It reminded him of the ocean, though deeper, older somehow. The scientist wrote something down quickly and looked at Briggs. "This isn't synthetic," she said. We'll know more after analysis, but it's biological, I think. Or at least it started that way. The words echoed in Michael's head long after they left. Biological. He had no idea what that meant in this context. Could it be some fossilized remnant, something preserved by time and mud? As the truck carrying the container rumbled away, he stood beside the empty hole, staring at the damp imprint it had left behind. The air there felt different now, heavier somehow, as if removing the object had released something into the world again. That evening, when the sun dipped behind the city's cranes, Michael sat on the canal wall, his boots dangling above the darkening mud. The water pumps hummed quietly below. Around him, the city moved on, unaware that anything unusual had happened. But he knew. Even without knowing what exactly he had uncovered, he could sense its importance. It wasn't just the money or the attention that might follow. Those things didn't interest him much. It was the feeling of having touched something ancient, something that had waded through decades of silence and filth to be found. The next day, the news spread quickly. A local television crew showed up at the main work site, filming the cleanup efforts and interviewing supervisors. They mentioned the unidentified object discovered by one of the workers but offered no details. The report was brief, but it was enough to spark curiosity. Journalists began calling the city offices. The internet filled with wild theories within hours. Some said it was an ancient relic from the city's founding era, others that it was toxic waste illegally buried by a factory in the 1970s. Michael's name wasn't mentioned, but he could feel the shift in the air. The quiet project he had been part of was now under a spotlight. By late afternoon, the site was cordoned off and security guards were posted near the entrance. Scientists from the state university arrived, bringing with them portable scanning equipment. They spent the day taking core samples from the nearby soil and testing for radiation or chemical contamination. Michael watched from a distance, leaning on his shovel. No one seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. That night, as the city lights flickered across the water, he walked home slowly, his body tired but his thoughts restless. He passed the empty cafes and the dim-lit storefronts, wondering what the lab would find. He imagined the object under bright white lights, surrounded by instruments and experts trying to name it. What if it wasn't man-made at all? What if it was something natural, formed by chance and time? Or worse, what if it was something that had once been alive? When he reached his apartment, he placed his notebook on the table and stared at it for a long time before opening it. He wrote down everything he remembered about the smell, the texture, the way the light had bent inside it. He described the shape, the weight, the reaction of the technicians. And then he stopped, hesitating before writing the last line. It looked like it was breathing, he wrote finally, then crossed it out, embarrassed by how foolish it sounded. But the image refused to leave him. The faint pulsing of color, the illusion of motion beneath the surface. He closed the notebook, set it aside, and turned off the light. The next morning, as he walked to work, the first headlines appeared in the papers. Mysterious object found in Richmond Canal. The accompanying photograph showed a blurred image of the orange surface through the mud, taken before it had been removed. The article mentioned preliminary analysis suggesting organic composition. Michael read it while waiting for coffee at a corner shop. Around him, people were already talking about it, speculating about buried treasure or ancient fossils. He felt a strange mixture of pride and discomfort. He wanted to tell them it wasn't treasure. It was something else, something harder to explain. But he said nothing. When he returned to the site, the section where he had worked was closed off completely. Only authorized personnel could enter now. Briggs saw him standing by the barrier and approached. "They're moving the rest of the material to the lab," he said. "You did good work, Mike. Not every day a man digs up something that gets the scientists all stirred up." Michael nodded quietly, unsure what to say. He watched as the trucks carried away more samples of mud and debris from the area where the object had been found. Each load felt like another piece of the story being taken away from him. As the day faded, he found himself standing once again by the drained edge of the canal. The light of sunset spilled across the wet walls, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. For a brief moment, it looked as though the glow had returned, shimmering faintly along the mud. He knew it was only the reflection of the sky, yet his heart quickened all the same. Somewhere, in a sealed room far from here, that strange, smooth object was being examined under the sterile light of a laboratory. And whatever it truly was, he knew one thing with certainty. It did not belong to the world as it was now. It belonged to the deep places of time, to silence and sediment and the patient decay of years. Michael stood there until the sun disappeared completely and the city lights flickered to life behind him. He felt both exhilarated and uneasy, as though he had awakened something that should have remained asleep. Tomorrow, he thought, they would have answers. But as the cool night air settled around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers waiting in that laboratory might not bring peace. They might only deepen the mystery that had risen from the mud. The object arrived at the university laboratory under heavy supervision and tight protocol. It was placed in a sealed container lined with soft foam, labeled simply as Sample 42RC. The technicians who carried it from the transport truck to the lab floor did so with the same cautious respect given to fragile artifacts from archaeological sites. For them, this was not just another specimen, it was something unknown, potentially valuable, possibly even dangerous. The air in the laboratory that morning was tense, a mixture of scientific curiosity and quiet disbelief. The university had been involved in municipal projects before, testing water samples, analyzing soil contaminants, but this was different. The object was not a contaminant, at least not in the usual sense. It was too deliberate, too intact. Within hours of its arrival, a team of chemists, oceanographers, and materials experts gathered around it, each with their own instruments and theories. The head of the team, Professor Helen Everett, was a woman of precision and restraint. She had spent years studying organic compounds from marine environments, and when she saw the object for the first time, her instinct was not excitement, but confusion. She circled it slowly, her gloved hands behind her back, observing the subtle gradations of color that rippled beneath its surface like trapped sunlight. "It's not resin," she said quietly to her assistant. "Not synthetic, at least not by any known formulation." The assistant nodded, adjusting the camera that would record every step of their analysis. They began with the basics: weight, density, temperature. It was heavier than expected for its size, over 20 kilograms, and yet the material was softer than stone. Under direct light, it exhibited a faint internal luminescence, not a glow, but a scattering of reflected particles that gave it depth. When they measured its surface temperature, they found it was slightly warmer than the surrounding air. That alone was enough to stir a ripple of unease through the team. As the tests progressed, fragments were taken from the underside, tiny shavings no larger than grains of rice, to be dissolved and examined under spectroscopic analysis. The results came back late in the afternoon, and they puzzled everyone. The molecular composition bore similarities to ambergris, the rare organic substance produced in the digestive tracts of whales, long used in perfumery and once more valuable than gold. Yet it wasn't identical. The ratios of certain fatty acids were distorted, the molecular chains unusually long. In some areas, the structure had fused with inorganic particles, iron, calcium, traces of silicate dust. It was as though nature and industry had conspired to create something that belonged to neither. The color, too, was unprecedented. Traditional ambergris ranged from gray to brown, sometimes with golden tints, but this was an intense dark orange, almost coppery, and when light struck it at an angle, it refracted into a spectrum of reds and golds that seemed to shift as one moved. Professor Everett noted the phenomenon carefully, hypothesizing that the hue might have been caused by prolonged exposure to pollutants in the canal water, a unique blend of saline runoff, industrial waste, and decaying organic matter. Decades of chemical transformation, combined with the peculiar conditions of stagnation, had altered the substance into something new. By evening, her preliminary report was complete. She summarized it in a single paragraph that would later be quoted by every newspaper in the region. The object appears to be a naturally derived organic mass, most consistent with the composition of ambergris, though uniquely altered by environmental conditions specific to Richmond's canal ecosystem. Its coloration and density indicate a rare case of long-term molecular transformation under semi-aerobic conditions. When the report reached the city offices, it was immediately seized upon by the media. The headlines the next morning read, "Rare Marine Treasure Found in Richmond Canal," "Amber Worth Millions Discovered Beneath City Streets," and "From Mud to Fortune, the Canal Miracle." None of them accurately reflected the scientific caution of the report, but accuracy was never what sold papers. The story of a priceless organic gem hidden in the city's forgotten waterways was too good to resist. Michael Harris first heard the news on a local radio station as he walked to work. He stopped mid-step when he heard his own name mentioned as the worker who had made the discovery. The announcer spoke with practiced enthusiasm, calling him the man whose careful eye turned a routine cleanup into a historical event. The attention unsettled him. He hadn't sought fame, nor did he trust the sudden warmth of the public spotlight. Yet, as he arrived at the canal, he found reporters already stationed along the barriers, their cameras poised. When they spotted him, flashes went off like lightning. He tried to ignore them and went about his duties, helping secure another section of the canal, but the atmosphere had changed. The project was no longer just a municipal cleanup. It was a spectacle. City officials toured the site, shaking hands and making statements about heritage, environmental stewardship, and the unexpected rewards of progress. They spoke of creating a museum exhibit once the object's authenticity was confirmed, of boosting tourism and pride in local history. Michael listened from a distance, silent, his hands deep in his pockets. Later that day, a representative from the university arrived to thank him personally. She handed him a copy of the preliminary report and a small envelope containing an official certificate of recognition. The letter inside bore the city seal, commending him for exceptional diligence and contribution to cultural discovery. It was signed by the mayor herself. He folded it neatly and placed it in his notebook, unsure what to make of it. That evening, he sat by his window, the letter on the table beside him, the radio murmuring news updates about the discovery. They spoke of the potential value, millions, some said, depended on purity. There were even whispers that private collectors had already begun contacting the city, offering to purchase the object for display. Michael stared out at the dark water of the harbor. The world had suddenly become very small and very loud around something that had lain silent in the mud for half a century. At the university, however, not everything was as simple as the media made it seem. A week after the initial tests, new results began to raise questions. Under a microscope embedded within the amber-like material, the analysts found metallic traces, tiny filaments and irregular fragments that didn't belong. One of them, when cleaned and examined, bore what looked like microscopic etching, as if it had once been a part of a machine or device. The discovery puzzled Everett's team. They began to wonder whether the mass had simply encased foreign debris during its formation, or whether something more deliberate had occurred. To investigate further, they performed non-invasive imaging using X-ray tomography. The scans revealed subtle density variations within the object, pockets of denser material, some linear, others irregular. None were large enough to be distinct, but their presence added a layer of complexity that made it impossible to classify the find as purely natural. When the data was presented to Professor Everett, she frowned and tapped her pen against the table. "There's more inside," she said softly. "We just can't see it clearly yet." The debate among the scientists grew more heated. Some argued that the metallic inclusions were incidental, perhaps remnants of industrial runoff that had settled into the substance during decades in the canal. Others suspected that the object might have formed around a pre-existing core, something man-made that had been coated and preserved by layers of organic material over time. The implications of that theory were more complicated. If it was true, the discovery was no longer simply a natural wonder. It might be evidence of an industrial accident, a forgotten experiment, or even a cover-up from the city's industrial past. The university issued a cautious statement to the press, clarifying that further tests were needed before drawing conclusions. But the rumor had already escaped into the public sphere. Overnight, social media filled with speculation, claims of secret projects, of wartime experiments, of hidden treasures. Conspiracy theorists flourished. Some insisted that the object was not ambergris at all, but a sealed container of unknown origin, its organic coating merely a disguise. For Michael, all of this unfolded like a slow, surreal storm. Reporters began visiting his apartment building, knocking on his door, leaving notes when he didn't answer. Neighbors congratulated him one day and envied him the next. His quiet life had evaporated. Even at work, people treated him differently. Some looked at him with admiration, others with resentment, as if his discovery had robbed them of the same chance. He began taking longer routes home, avoiding crowds. One night, unable to sleep, he walked back to the canal. The work site was deserted, fenced off and silent under the pale wash of streetlights. He stood at the edge of the drained channel, staring down into the empty space where he had found the object. The mud had hardened into uneven ridges, marked by the prints of boots and tires. He crouched and touched the surface. It was cool now, lifeless, but in his mind he could still see that faint orange shimmer beneath the water, that strange glimmer that had caught his eye. Somehow, despite all the tests and theories, he felt the scientists had missed something essential. The object wasn't merely a product of nature or accident. It carried a presence that words like composition and density could not describe. It was as though time itself had folded around it, preserving not just matter but memory. He couldn't explain it logically, and he didn't dare voice it aloud. But deep down, he knew that whatever it was, it had chosen to reveal itself when the canal was ready, and when he was. Back at the university, the testing continued late into the night. Under the sterile glare of laboratory lights, the mysterious mass sat on a metal table, surrounded by instruments humming quietly. The air was dry, filled with the faint scent of solvents and ozone. Professor Everett leaned close, studying the surface once more. When her gloved hand passed near it, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of light ripple across it. A trick of reflection, she told herself. Yet she could not shake the feeling that the substance seemed to respond, ever so slightly, to warmth and movement. She made a note in her journal. Persistent internal refraction observed, source unknown. Optical properties may be dynamic, not static. Outside the laboratory, the city's excitement continued to grow. The mayor announced that once the analysis was complete, the object would be displayed temporarily at the Municipal Museum before being moved to a permanent scientific facility. Tickets were already being discussed. Committees were being formed. Money had entered the conversation now, and with it, pressure. The story of a humble worker who found fortune in the mud had captured the public imagination, and there was no turning back. For Michael, however, the glow of that fortune felt distant and hollow. He still carried the memory of the discovery not as triumph, but as intrusion. Each time he thought of it, he remembered the stillness of the canal before he touched it, the way the air had seemed to pause as if holding its breath. Now, with the object gone, the silence felt different. Emptier, but also unsettled, as though something beneath the city's surface had been disturbed and would not rest easily again. The laboratory lights burned late into the night, and the object sat at the center of it all, silent and inscrutable. Scientists studied its chemistry, the media celebrated its value, and Michael dreamed restlessly of the canal, its dark, slow water, the smell of mud, and the single spark of orange that had started it all. None of them yet understood that this was only the beginning, that what lay within the strange amber shell would soon raise more questions than answers, and that the city of Richmond, which had sought to clean its forgotten canal, had instead unearthed a mystery that reached far deeper than the mud. The city of Richmond had not experienced this kind of attention in decades. Newspapers from across the country began sending their correspondents. Television crews set up daily along the banks of the canal, and a growing crowd of amateur treasure hunters and curious tourists lined up behind the orange barricades, hoping to catch a glimpse of the place where it all began. The canal, once an afterthought, a decaying scar through the city's midsection, had been reborn as the epicenter of national fascination. In the early days of the discovery, the tone was celebratory. Journalists dubbed the orange-hued object the Richmond Amber, a name that spread quickly across headlines, social feeds, and radio broadcasts. The city council leaned into the narrative with practiced ease, holding press briefings on the steps of City Hall, each official eager to associate themselves with the story of unexpected fortune. One councilman went so far as to call the find a symbol of rebirth rising from the forgotten, a phrase that would be repeated endlessly in news coverage. For Michael Harris, the man at the center of it all, the world had turned into something unrecognizable. In the days following the lab's first report, Michael found himself being watched, stopped on the street, approached by strangers. He received letters, some congratulatory, others strange, asking him to bless jewelry with his luck or to share the spiritual message of the object. There were calls from local talk shows and late-night radio programs inviting him to speak. He declined them all. His once solitary workspace along the canal had become a public exhibit. Workers in fluorescent vests now guarded the site not just for safety, but to keep the public at bay. Fencing had been extended, and a security firm hired by the city monitored the perimeter day and night. Tourism boards printed brochures about the canal's history, most of it hastily written and full of romanticized speculation. Vendors popped up along the adjacent walkways, selling replicas of the object, cheap plastic ovals painted orange and amber, strung on necklaces or mounted on keychains. Michael began to feel as though the ground beneath him had shifted, like the very earth of the canal had cracked open and let loose something more than mud. He tried to continue with the cleanup work, but every shovel of dirt felt performative now, each step watched. The other workers treated him differently. Some offered quiet congratulations, others teased him in a tone that carried more envy than humor. "Found any more $1,000,000 eggs, Mike?" they'd say, with a grin that didn't reach their eyes. He responded politely, if at all, then returned to his work, moving slower each day, the silence of his thoughts becoming louder than the noise around him. At home, his mailbox overflowed. Legal notices, media requests, even business proposals from people he had never met. A law firm contacted him with an offer to represent his interests in any future ownership dispute. The city, meanwhile, remained deliberately vague about the legal status of the find. Officially, the object belonged to no one until all scientific analysis had concluded, but it was clear that private buyers were circling, and the city wanted its share. Late one night, Michael received a certified letter from a museum foundation in California offering a preliminary sum in the range of low seven figures for the object, pending authentication and transfer of rights. He read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the back of a drawer. He did not mention it to anyone. Amid all the noise, a different kind of attention began to emerge. In the fourth week after the discovery, the university's research team published a revised report. It confirmed the object's primarily organic nature, aligned closely with that of ambergris, but also disclosed the discovery of embedded foreign materials. Microscopic analysis had uncovered minute metallic elements, some no larger than dust, others recognizable under extreme magnification. One fragment bore what appeared to be a stamped set of alphanumeric characters, partially degraded but still distinguishable. The scientific community took note. A respected journal issued a commentary questioning the possibility of accidental incorporation. The probability that a large organic mass would encapsulate industrial metal fragments with stamped identifiers, and do so without any structural compromise, is mathematically low, the article stated. Almost overnight, the narrative changed. News anchors, once cheerful, now adopted a tone of mystery. Speculation spread online. Theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Some said the object was formed around discarded military equipment, perhaps a navigation core from a Cold War submarine, accidentally lost or buried during a classified operation. Others spun elaborate stories about secret government programs, hidden chambers beneath the city, or alien technology masked by natural materials. Michael watched these developments with growing unease. What he had once thought of as a strange, beautiful anomaly was now being reframed into a question, one with more weight than he had ever intended to carry. The mayor's office attempted to manage the narrative, holding a press conference to assure the public that the object remains under secure, transparent study by qualified professionals. But the damage had been done. The mystery was more seductive than any official explanation. One morning, a group of protesters appeared outside the university gates, holding signs that read, "Tell the truth about the canal" and "Stop the cover-up." Among them were a few familiar faces from earlier crowds, now transformed from tourists into self-proclaimed truth-seekers. Michael began avoiding the main roads. He altered his route to the work site, entering through side alleys and slipping past the fences before sunrise. The canal, once the source of peace in his routines, had become a battleground of ideas and motives he did not understand. The university responded to the growing pressure by releasing more data. They admitted that one of the embedded fragments appeared to match a component used in mid-century radio transceivers, the kind manufactured in the late 1950s. The metal was pitted and worn, but its shape was consistent with tuning forks used in maritime communication devices. That detail set off a new storm of speculation. Was the object an accidental fusion, or had someone deliberately sealed a device within it? At home, Michael turned off the radio. He unplugged the television. He stopped reading the newspapers. He returned instead to his notebooks, paging through the sketches he had made of the canal walls, the placement of debris, the curvature of the side channel. He lingered longest over the first drawing he had made of the glow, the way it had seemed alive, reacting to the light. He began to question what he had seen. Had he really noticed the glow before he began to dig, or had his mind constructed it afterward, filling in the mystery to make the moment feel larger than it was? The memory wavered now, caught between certainty and doubt. One evening, while reviewing his earliest notes, he realized something he had not noticed before. The location where the object had been found did not match the original canal schematics. On the old map from 1952, the side channel where he had worked was marked as a service trench, never meant to hold water for any prolonged period. But at some point in the late 1960s, the city had rerouted a portion of runoff drainage into it and sealed it behind a concrete bulkhead. He stared at the map for a long time. Why seal a trench that led nowhere? Why divert water there unless to bury something? The question gnawed at him. He returned to the site under the cover of night, using his old access badge and the keys he had never turned in. The side channel was dark and silent, the mud hardened into a cracked floor. He walked slowly, flashlight in hand, his breath visible in the cold. At the far bend of the trench, near the original location, he knelt and ran his fingers along the wall. There, beneath a layer of grime, he found it, a small metallic protrusion, half buried, overlooked in the chaos of excavation. It was no larger than a coin, but when he scraped away the mud, he saw that it wasn't just a fragment. It was a sliver of plate metal with a stamped number. His heart pounded. He retrieved a plastic bag from his pocket, placed the fragment inside, and left the trench without a word. The next morning, he delivered it to the university lab without fanfare. The technician who received it looked at him with wide eyes but said nothing. Michael turned and walked away. He told no one. That evening, a soft rain fell over Richmond. The city buzzed with speculation and profit. The canal was now illuminated by strings of decorative lights, and a new sign stood by the fence. Future site of Richmond Riverwalk, where history resurfaced. Michael sat by the water, far from the noise, the faint smell of rain mixing with the scent of mud and stone. He held the map in one hand, the memory of the stamped metal in the other, and felt the silence press around him once more. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that comes before the world changes shape. He had found something that was never meant to be seen again. And now the question was not whether the city would understand what it was, but whether it could afford to know. The city's lights still flickered late into the night, casting reflections over the murky puddles left behind by the afternoon rain. In those still waters, the glowing string lights along the canal danced like broken fireflies, twisting across the surface before disappearing into the mud. Michael Harris stood just beyond the new barriers, behind the public display of progress and pride, watching the water slide slowly back into the lowest parts of the trench. The pumps had been reduced in frequency now that most of the canal had been cleared, but the side channel, the forgotten, twisted bend that had yielded so much attention, remained dry, deliberately untouched while the city decided what to do with it. In that silence, far from the reporters and tour guides and school field trips, Michael slipped past the fence using the old badge still hanging from his jacket's inner pocket. No one had remembered to deactivate it. Or perhaps they had, and simply didn't care. The security guards were stationed closer to the museum entrance now, where the replica of the amber object had already gone on display. It wasn't the real piece. The university had retained custody of the original for continued analysis. But the city had rushed to install something, anything, to satisfy the public's hunger for proximity to the mystery. Michael descended into the trench under a low moon and without a flashlight. The path was familiar now, every crack in the wall and crevice in the mud etched into his memory. The earth had hardened in places, split open in others. The smell of old water still lingered, metallic, heavy with algae and rot. The once fluid mud had dried into a skin, brittle and uneven beneath his boots. But he didn't stop until he reached the bend. There, in the spot where the original object had been found, he knelt once more. In his hand he held a brush, soft, bristled, and a thin steel tool. Not the crude shovel he had used before, but instruments of care and purpose. He worked slowly, breathing through his nose, letting his hands guide him more than his eyes. The surface felt different, a change in texture, a shift in temperature. And then it was there, barely a finger's width beneath the surface, a gleam of dull bronze. It was not large, a slice of metal, thin and flaked at the edges, curved slightly as if it had once formed a part of a cylinder. He lifted it gently into the palm of his glove, brushing away the film of earth. Under the layers of corrosion, a number revealed itself, half of a stamped serial code, the rest eaten away by time. The characters were mechanical, precise, nothing natural about them. He didn't know what the code meant. Not yet. But it proved one thing definitively. The object, the so-called Richmond amber, had not formed around random detritus. Something had been placed here. He marked the spot with a strip of cloth, just in case. But the fragment was all he needed for now. He turned to leave, slipping it into a protective sleeve in his jacket, the knowledge of it humming in his bones. The city wanted celebration, tourism, walking paths, and commemorative plaques. It did not want this. It did not want a second object. It did not want questions. The next morning, Michael walked through the university gates alone, dressed in the same heavy jacket, his hands deep in his pockets. He entered the side laboratory annex without announcement. The technician on duty was young, bleary-eyed from too much screen time and too little sleep. When he saw Michael, he blinked twice, then stood quickly. Michael handed over the sealed sleeve. The technician stared at it, hesitating, then gestured toward the back lab without a word. Within an hour, the fragment was under the scope. The confirmation came almost immediately. Stamped lettering, bronze alloy with rare earth elements, unmistakably industrial, not waste, not runoff, not a naturally trapped shard of debris. It wasn't just that something man-made had fused with the amber-like substance. It was that the amber had grown around it, preserved it, shielded it, like a husk around a seed. Michael sat in the corner of the lab, arms crossed, as the team swarmed the workstation, whispering to one another in tones too low to catch. One of them, a postdoctoral fellow with thick glasses and a nervous energy, spoke the words aloud that no one else wanted to say. "This wasn't an accident," he murmured. "Somebody put this here." The university convened an emergency meeting that afternoon. Scientists, administrators, and city representatives packed the old boardroom, the heavy oak table scarred from decades of coffee mugs and tense debates. At the head sat Professor Everett, her fingers folded tightly in front of her, the original amber object displayed in a containment box behind her chair like a silent witness. Michael was invited to sit at the table, but he chose a chair against the wall instead. They discussed the fragment, its probable age, its alloy composition, the implications of its placement. Theories flew. Some suggested that the object had formed around a military probe. Others believed it was the byproduct of a chemical dumping experiment gone wrong, organic material from marine life reacting over time with industrial waste. But the most careful voices, the ones who had studied the molecular structure, the density gradients, the way the organic material seemed to preserve, even protect the metallic interior, spoke quietly, with the kind of fear that didn't show on faces but lived in the gaps between their sentences. There was no clear answer, only a pattern, a probability, a direction. And then the second discovery came. In the days that followed, as the university lab began to examine nearby sediment samples taken from Michael's trench, a second object was identified, not as large as the first, but unmistakably similar in structure. It, too, contained metallic inclusions. It, too, emitted the same faint warmth and refracted orange light under specific conditions. Michael was called back to the canal the next morning. This time, the site was closed to the public completely. Guards in plain uniforms stood at every entrance, their radios humming with codes and updates. The second object had been extracted with greater care, placed directly into a sterile transport crate, and moved to a different laboratory under temporary lockdown. Michael watched it leave with a strange emptiness in his chest. The first time he had felt awe. The second time he felt inevitability. That evening, the city quietly pulled down the commemorative banner over the canal's entrance. The planned ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Riverwalk Park was postponed. No public explanation was given. The local news anchors, so jubilant only days before, now spoke in quieter tones. The mayor's office issued a one-line statement. "We are continuing to support the university's work as new findings emerge." In truth, no one knew what to do. The discovery had shifted from curiosity to uncertainty to tension. Michael returned home and sat at his kitchen table for a long time, the soft light of dusk filtering through the blinds. The second object's removal had changed something, not just for the city, but for him. The knowledge that it wasn't alone, that the first had not been a singular event, had cracked open a door in his mind that would not close again. He pulled out his original notebook, now frayed and smudged at the edges, and began a new page. He drew the bend in the canal, the angles of the walls, the soil layers. He marked the position of the first object, then the second. The pattern wasn't random. There was symmetry, spacing, as if someone had placed them deliberately at measured intervals and then buried them beneath decades of water and silence. But who? And why? He considered what it would take to hide something in such a way. Not just to discard it, but to plant it, ensuring that it would be shielded, preserved, transformed into something unrecognizable. Not destroyed. Hidden. He closed the notebook and stood at the window, staring down at the city's rooftops as the streetlights flickered on. In the distance, the canal snaked through the city like an old scar, healing over with new concrete and lights, but beneath it, the old blood still moved. Somewhere along that channel, perhaps deeper than they had yet dug, more objects waited. Perhaps there was a third, perhaps a fourth. Each one placed not randomly, but with purpose. Each one carrying within it not just remnants of metal, but pieces of history that someone had once gone to great lengths to erase. Michael didn't believe in fate, but he believed in work, in attention, in method, and something in his gut told him the pattern was only beginning to show itself. Later that night, he returned to the trench one last time. The guards recognized him now and said nothing. He moved past them silently and descended once more into the dark. The moon was full, casting pale light over the broken surface of the canal bed. He walked to the far edge of the bend and knelt, placing his hand flat against the ground. He listened, not with his ears, but with the part of himself that had always known how to read the world through its weight and resistance. There, beneath the earth, the silt held its breath. Not sleeping. Waiting. And he would be ready when it spoke again. The months that followed the discovery of the amber-like object passed in a blur of muted excitement, guarded curiosity, and restrained fear. Richmond had changed in ways that were both visible and invisible. Streets once ignored now bore placards describing the history of the canal. Traffic was redirected to accommodate tour groups and scientific teams. The city council held monthly briefings, their language precise, careful, always walking the line between celebration and caution. Yet beneath the ceremonial presentations and the media photographs of city officials standing beside sanitized portions of the canal, a quiet tension persisted, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. Michael Harris had grown accustomed to the changes, though he had never grown comfortable with them. He no longer walked to the site with casual indifference. He approached each day with a sense of purpose, aware that the city, the scientists, the media, and even the tourists were all operating within a narrative he had unwittingly created. Despite the recognition, despite the letters, the interviews, the tentative offers of financial gain, he felt more like a witness than a hero. Every time he stood near the side channel, the stretch where the original object had been discovered, he sensed a stillness that no amount of bureaucratic attention could disturb. The canal had a memory, and he had become its reluctant custodian. The museum exhibit had opened months after the object was first analyzed. A secure case held the amber-like mass surrounded by detailed charts, photographs, and diagrams produced by the university's team. Visitors lined up outside, waiting for a chance to glimpse the famed discovery, unaware that what they saw was only a fragment of the canal's secret. Michael had been invited to the unveiling but chose to observe from the periphery. He stood behind the crowd, unnoticed, watching faces pressed against glass as they tried to comprehend something far larger than their daily lives. Some whispered to their companions, speculating about the object's origin, its value, its history. Few understood the weight of decades of accumulation, the confluence of time, chemistry, and human neglect that had produced what lay behind the glass. The second object, removed from the same bend of the side channel, had been studied with equal care, but had never made it to public display. Its metallic inclusions, faint but unmistakable, had raised more questions than answers. Scientists debated whether the fragments were remnants of machinery, devices, or even deliberate markers. Some suggested they were part of experiments from a bygone era, lost records of industrial testing or clandestine research. Others argued that the fragments were nothing more than coincidental inclusions, absorbed into the organic mass by natural processes. No conclusion satisfied all parties, and the laboratory's reports grew increasingly cautious, laden with qualifiers and hedged language. Michael spent hours reviewing his notebooks, tracing the details of the canal, the placement of debris, the contours of the side channel. He traced the patterns with his finger over the sketches, recalling the hours spent kneeling in mud, brushing and scraping carefully to uncover what lay beneath. Each line he drew represented a moment, a decision, a discovery. The more he studied, the more he saw the hidden symmetry, the intentionality behind the placement of the objects, the way sediment layers formed around them, the subtle differences between the two discoveries that suggested careful orchestration rather than happenstance. He often returned to the canal at night, long after the public and the crews had left. The barriers had been left in place, but he knew the routes, the gaps, the ways to move unnoticed. The water in the main channel reflected the moonlight, long and silver, while the side channel remained dry, hollowed out like a grave. He knelt there, sometimes speaking aloud, sometimes silently, questioning the purpose, the origin, the intent behind the placement of the objects. Each discovery had opened a door, and he feared that what lay further down the channel might reveal a past too large for the city to absorb. The nights were long and still, the only sounds the distant hum of pumps, the soft rustling of leaves, and occasionally the muted splash of a rat scuttling along the exposed mud. Michael found solace in these nocturnal visits. The city above moved in its usual rhythms, oblivious to the deeper truth concealed beneath decades of neglect and sediment. The amber-like objects had awakened something old, something patient, and he alone seemed attuned to its quiet insistence. Over time, he realized that the true impact of the discovery was not the value assigned by scientists or the media, nor the potential fortune attached to its ownership. The impact was more subtle, more profound. It had shifted the city's perception of its own history. The canal was no longer merely infrastructure, it was a repository of time, memory, and hidden consequences. The canal had been forgotten, overlooked, dismissed, yet it had endured. In revealing its secret, the city had been forced to confront its past, to acknowledge the layers of human activity and natural change that had accumulated over decades. Michael thought often of the faint glow that had first caught his attention. It had been subtle, almost imperceptible, yet enough to draw him into the mud and into history. That moment, the first recognition, the pause, the careful scraping of sediment, had been an act of witnessing. The glow was gone now, the object removed, analyzed, contained, yet its effect lingered. He understood that discoveries of this sort did not exist in isolation. They echoed outward, altering perception, inspiring speculation, and compelling reflection. The city adapted around the discovery. The Riverwalk project resumed in a more measured manner, guided by the lessons of the side channel. Environmental safeguards were increased, and sections of the canal were designated as preservation zones. The university's research team continued to study the objects, expanding their analyses to include additional sediment samples and microscopic examinations of layers that had previously gone unnoticed. Each test produced more questions, deepening the mystery while enriching the scientific understanding of the complex interplay between organic and inorganic material in a unique aquatic environment. Meanwhile, Michael continued his quiet vigil. He walked the canals, measured angles, inspected the soil, and cataloged observations in his notebooks. He did not seek fame or fortune, though he received acknowledgment for both. He had learned that recognition was fleeting and that the object's presence, its existence within the canal, was more permanent and more significant than any public acclaim. The knowledge of its origin, its composition, its careful concealment and preservation carried a weight that no certificate or headline could convey. Sometimes, after the public had gone and the night settled over the city, he would stand at the edge of the side channel and touch the hardened mud. He could feel the contours of the trench, the memory embedded in the layers of sediment, the subtle undulations that had once held something extraordinary. He imagined the object's slow formation, the decades it had spent hidden, reshaping itself, absorbing elements from the water, the earth, and the decay around it. The more he imagined, the more he felt connected to a timeline that extended beyond his own life, beyond the lives of the workers who had built the canal, and even beyond the city itself. On such nights, he considered the pattern of discovery. The first object had been found through patient observation and meticulous effort. The second, deeper investigation had revealed a deliberate inclusion, suggesting design and intent. What had not yet been found, what might lie further along the hidden channels, was uncertain. And yet, he knew that the canal had more to offer, more stories, more secrets waiting to be uncovered. He accepted that he might never know the full truth and that some mysteries were meant to remain partially veiled. As the city slept, he would linger at the edge, tracing the faint line of the channel in the silver moonlight. The air carried the scent of damp concrete, algae, and the faint metallic tang of water. Somewhere below, in the dark, the sediment still held its secrets, unmoved, patient, and deliberate. Michael understood now that discovery was not a single event, but a continuum, a series of observations, of attentions paid, of moments where time and effort intersected with history. When the morning light finally returned, he would rise, make his way back to the university, and continue the work of cataloging, observing, and protecting. The city above would continue its celebrations, its tourism, its media coverage. The museum would display the first object behind glass, visitors would marvel at its color and composition, and scientists would publish cautious, measured papers on its unique properties. And Michael would walk alone along the canal, beneath the hum of pumps and the rustling of leaves, tracing the paths he had known so well, remembering the glow beneath the mud, and feeling the persistent presence of time itself in the channels below. He had discovered something remarkable, but more importantly, he had become a custodian of a truth that was not fully his own, a truth embedded in sediment, in water, in the quiet pulse of a forgotten city. The canal had awakened, and through it he had awakened to the realization that some things, once revealed, do not return to silence. The city would remember the discovery, the museum would display the amber-like object, and the story would circulate in papers, online, and in conversation. Yet the deeper reality, the full extent of the pattern, and the intentionality embedded in the canal remained mostly unseen, known only to those who had the patience, the attention, and the respect to study it. Michael understood this. He respected it. And in the quiet reflection by the moonlit trench, he knew that the work of understanding was only beginning. As dawn crept slowly across the horizon, painting the canal walls with gold and silver, Michael Harris stood and watched. He knew that the city, the museum, and the world might see the objects, the color, the material. They might measure it, test it, assign it value, and tell stories about it. But beneath the surface, in the layers of mud, sediment, and history, the canal's secrets were eternal. They had waited 70 years to be found. And now that they would continue to wait, patient and deliberate, for the next observer, the next moment, the next careful hand willing to notice, to question, to understand. Michael turned away from the edge, walking back toward the street, leaving behind the dark, hollow channel, aware that the city would never be the same. And yet, in the quiet continuity of the water, mud, and sediment, he sensed a subtle reassurance. The canal was still there, still holding its memories, still waiting to reveal what it would on its own terms in its own time. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next shocking discovery. Don't stop here. Watch our other videos to uncover even more hidden secrets and unbelievable finds. And if this video blew your mind, share it with your friends and see who else will be amazed.